So today I want to talk about immigration and gender and race and all that stuff and how those things are connected. So we've talked a lot about those economic changes and some of the drastic economic changes that take place in the Gilded Age, a real surge in GNP and gross national product, gross domestic product that grow out of the changes that we've been talking about, the expansion of the railroad system, the development of new technologies, but particularly technology, including technologies that we can't necessarily see, a drastic expansion of agriculture. Um, but I want to talk today about ideas about manhood and womanhood and the middle class and the working class and how people define themselves. Because by and large, when people talked about themselves in relationship to the middle class or in the working class, they did so largely through the lens, if you will, of gender and race. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So it's not just womanhood, but also manhood that are important. And these things are shifting in the Gilded Age. And we're going to have to step back a little bit and talk about an earlier time before the Gilded Age to get a sense of when these changes take place. Because changes in manhood and womanhood there are some pretty drastic changes that take place in the 1890s. But to understand that, we need to understand sort of the groundwork. All right, first of all, the middle class. What is the middle class? I'm defining it here as basically occupation and wealth, and this would be the top roughly 10% of the population. Almost all of these people would be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These would be primarily Protestants, relatively few Catholics. Of the 76 million people in the 1900 census, about 2.5% of that population is in the professions. And assuming those people are married, those are men mostly, or almost entirely, assuming those are married, roughly 5% of adults, and then well off farmers and planters and others gives us roughly the same amount, so about 10%. So of this middle class, about half actually would be in some agricultural profession, but would see themselves as being kind of the substantial middle class and as they saw it, the kind of center of the nation. This middle class is going to be important to sort of understand because while it's a relatively small percentage of the population, they're going to be tremendously important. Okay, so some things that are changing. Whereas a great majority of the immigrants before the war had been farmers of one sort or another, peasants, after the war, a larger and larger portion of the people who come to the U.S. Come from cities, at times up to 30%. So while it's primarily rural migration, there are many more urban folks that are coming into the United States from Europe. And they come with skills which are appropriated in limited ways by urban industries. Immigrants come, though, in larger and larger boatloads, largely because of wheat. Because the U.S. is exporting a tremendous amount of wheat after the war. As I said before, roughly 2 to 3 bushels for every person living west of the Rhine each year is being transported from the United States to Europe. And those ships, like the Great Eastern here, which could hold, which were nearly 700 feet long, this is one of the largest. It had 22,000 tons or 22 million pounds, 44 million pounds, I guess. They carried hundreds of tons of wheat to Europe. And the ships returning from Europe had relatively cheap fares because there was relatively little that Europe brought back. There were some manufactured goods, tin, some other goods that were coming, but in terms of bulk, these ships come back initially, or the fear was that they would come back empty. And so what happens then right around 1868 or so is we get a lot of these ships that start to use what are called steerage compartments. And these steerage compartments are basically the compartments that had held grain going to Europe. Coming back from Europe, it's relatively cheap, about, let's say, $20 or so in 1870 dollars to get across from Europe to the United States. And those cheapest fares were in steerage and basically effectively under the decks where the grain was stored on the trip inward. these could carry 1,000 or more people across the Atlantic cheaply, if not always safely. These were relatively dangerous, could be relatively dangerous places. And things like cholera and other diseases could spread fairly rapidly on these ships. Okay, let's take a look at this image, give you a sense of where people are coming from. And what's going on in this image? What's changing about the composition of folks as we move into the 1890s and forward? Yeah, spikes in the 1880s and 19 teens. Good. So there are important spikes. There's a Panic of 1873 where you see a massive dip. Southern and Eastern European immigration is increasing, as Claire says. Chinese Exclusion Act. So let's see, North America. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just but right, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. You see a drastic drop in folks coming from Asia and the Americas, and that's largely because of Chinese exclusion. Huge growth from the East and South over time, and the rise of Eastern and Southern Europeans, and fewer Northwestern Europeans as we move into the 1890s or so. Okay, so that's important because the people who are coming are different people. So they're somewhat more urban, and the place they're ending up is here. This is Castle Garden. So this is before Ellis Island, and Castle Garden is this sort of guarded place in New York, very much like the guarded place in California, where it does start to level out in 1921. As we'll talk about later, the percentage of people that's foreign, particularly in cities, is very, very, very high. And this is going to affect people's view of the city by and large. So Castle Garden, because and speaking to Jacob's point, immigration drops with the Immigration Exclusion Acts of the 20s and forward. There's another thing that drops immigration, of course, is World War One, when Germans are U-boats are potentially attacking immigrant steamships, and so we do see a massive drop off really starting in 1914. But immigration exclusion in the 20s is also important for understanding the drop. Okay, so this is Castle Garden, and basically you couldn't get out of this place. You'd be inspected to make sure that you didn't have various kinds of diseases and things like that, but you also had to prove that you weren't indigent. And so what happens is that some people who come over with relatively little in terms of money can't get out until they sign a contract with someone to do work. And the railroads are often here waiting for people who don't have the person that they're supposed to be meeting up with, who's going to vouch for them, and they snatch those folks up and use them on the railroads. And so there's a similar kind of forced labor on places like the Union Pacific and elsewhere, where people end up doing this work sort of basically under their own auspices, but not necessarily always having much control over the work that they do for the first few years or so. So the immigrants that are coming over are very different. And there are lots of stereotypes, as you can imagine, about these new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Some of them, because the fare is so cheap, coming over with relatively little money. And so this is an image, an anti-immigration image from the 1890s, to give you a sense of what the fears of immigrants are. And so what are some of the fears of immigrants that we see here in this photo? What are some of the stereotypes? That they're violent. Okay, and so you can see there's a person there on the bottom who's got a bag, and the bag says dynamiter. So this is somebody who's familiar with the use of dynamite and is presumably someone who's going to blow up cities. We have somebody with the kind of mustaches there on the right, bad hygiene, right? Dirty, conspiring, okay. That they're communist, right? And so one of them on the far right is with a beard, not quite all the way to the right, with a beard and a knife in his belt, is a communist. They're anarchists, and there's a black hand. And they're dirty and poor, right? They're coming from the sewers of Russia, of Germany, and of, well, I guess that's Italy. I don't know how Italy ended up in the north and not the south, but anyway, is that right? Yeah, why is Italy in the north? Anyways, Italia, Russia, and Germany. They look homeless, they're dirty and poor. And so these are some of the stereotypes that people have of them, a fear that these people are dangerous. A lot of our sense, we have this image of them as pouring in and no idea where they're going. And this is really the result of a lot of the reporting about them. But in fact, yeah, he's got he doesn't have a newspaper, but he has something that says liberty to break the law, freedom from justice. That's what he's holding in his hand. And at the top it says Liberty Hall, liberty, not license. So the fear is that all of the anarchists and communists and socialists of Europe, who are kind of driven out by the anti-socialist laws in Germany, for example, are going to end up in the United States. Now, these people were not, by and large, just sort of flowing in. There was a lot of immigrant clustering. So Italians, for example, ended up in primarily in outdoor work, like street construction. They shunned indoor meatpacking, for example. Irish immigrants with older children went to textile towns so that they could all work together. East European Jews found it easier to work with German Jews who had already settled. And the reason for that is that they knew the kosher rules, for example. They had Saturday off, not Sunday off. They spoke Yiddish. And so it was possible for these East European Jews to work for German Jews in a way that was less radically different. There was tended to be chain migration with families, so that people would come over, usually a father, the head of the household, might come over and establish himself, and then after a few years bring over children and wives and others, and also communities as a whole that would settle, whole religious communities that would settle in the West. Poles would establish east beachheads in a Pittsburgh plant and then draw relatives over decades. And so we see lots of Poles and Hungarians ending up in Pittsburgh. There were limited dispersion, though. In search of followers. Oh, God. Okay, right. Thanks. So we have spam even on Twitch, of course. Italians were in construction gangs and barber shops, Polish women in restaurants and kitchen jobs in Chicago and Detroit. Polish women preferred restaurant and kitchen jobs to housekeeping jobs. All right, so New York was the center of this migration, and the reason for this is fairly straightforward, that New York had deep ports. It was a center of commerce initially, with the New York stock exchange going all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century, but also the Castle Garden, which was a large embarkation point. This is where the grain went, and it would come back, the ships would come back to New York. But the other crucial thing is there were deep drafts, that New York had a very, very deep port, and so the newer ships with the screw propellers and like the Great Eastern, could land in New York relatively easily. And they, as a result, bypassed old ports like Philadelphia and Boston, which didn't have ports that were quite as deep. So New York becomes the landing, but many people stay. Many people arrive in New York thinking that they're going to go to the Great West, to go to Kansas or something like that, but they stay. These immigrants often stay in these regions. So New York becomes a manufacturing hub. And this is important. Most cities in Europe had been older hubs, commercial hubs and things like that, but New York becomes a place where things are manufactured or remanufactured. Now, you're not going to have big industry like steel mills and things like that, but you're going to have lots of small industry. So there were problems. There was disease, crowding, poor ventilation, rapidly spreading fires in New York. And the dumbbell housing that we saw before was actually a reform of the 1870s and 80s, which was designed to, those little cells for the dumbbells with the little gaps in the middle were designed to prevent fires from spreading too rapidly. No, I wouldn't say most of the time, but it's really difficult to sort of generalize about this. But I want to say something like 40% of the people who come are so around a third of the people who come to New York are bound to go further west, and they're more likely to be able to get further west if they've got some money already. Some people think that they're going to arrive in New York, make some money after 2 or 3 years, and then head west. But those people often don't make enough to do that. Yeah, it's skilled labor that's there. It's also because of the port, it's possible for to bring together various manufactured goods and things like that. So it's especially important for things like clothing, because lots of cloth is coming in from multiple places, and so you see the sort of sweatshops of New York where clothing is manufactured. You see, I'm trying to think of what some of the other important New York manufacturing that takes place, New York City manufacturing that takes place. Uh, there is, believe it or not, in New York, a whole lot of tanning that takes place because lots of cattle and beef and things like that end up in New York. And then the hides are taken off when the cattle is slaughtered, and those hides are then turned into leather goods and things like that. So there's a lot of basically clothing manufacture that we see. Yeah, so they're poor enough that they can't really move out. Many of the folks, they're sort of stuck in New York. Um, okay, I want to talk about our image of these folks, and a lot of that comes from Jacob Riis, who is born in Denmark in 1849. He comes to the U.S. in 1870, and he's a police reporter for the New York Tribune. And he learns about the least appealing parts of the city, including the Bowery, Five Points, and the Tenderloin district. And we'll talk about a little bit more about this when we get to Gay New York later. And he hears about this German discovery of mixing magnesium with potassium chlorate and antimony sulfide powder to produce a flash. And with flash photography, he's able to sort of make photographs of places that had previously been inaccessible. So photography emerges going all the way back to 1837, but it's mostly outdoors photography, and indoor photography is actually very complicated unless you have a great deal of light. What he's able to do is take sort of almost candid shots in places that were otherwise not accessible, and this is so he's able to sort of capture immigrant life in New York City. And so this is 5 Points in New York, not 5 Points in Athens, but 5 Points in New York, a place where basically five roads come together, and it was an important place for crime in this period. And this is the inside of a dive, a place where you could rent, for 10 cents a night, you could just get a blanket and a place to sleep. Right. So some of the reform acts are going to be about blocking this immigration. We see tremendous amount of immigration in this period, and it's reactions to this that's going to lead to what we call immigrant reform. Okay, now I want to talk about women because it's helpful to understand this people's perceptions of class in relationship to manhood and womanhood. So for women, in the 18th century, as the U.S. becomes more industrial over the course of the period, with a growing class of immigrant wage laborers, women's lives diverged enormously depending on whether or not they were in the middle class. So middle class women had a very different experience than most working class women. So going back to the Revolution and the early 1800s, going up to around 1830 or so, fairly well-off women had servants, and they wouldn't look in some ways that different from poorer women. Few women worked for wages in the 18th century, but most women who were in middle-class houses worked in producing goods for use at home. They preserve food, make soap, mend clothes, and keep vegetable gardens. This starts to change around the time of Queen Victoria, around 1837, when Queen Victoria's reign begins. And by the middle to by around 1830, 1840, what we see is the kind of image of the spinning wheel, which had been a symbol, you see here, is the kind of symbol for women of a productive household. By the 1840s and 1850s, the spinning wheel becomes evidence of poverty. And so the idea of manufacturing at home is considered a sort of household failure in one sort or another. Increasingly, women's waged work became a sign of degradation. Any kind of work by women was seen as a sign of degradation. So, for example, it was a sign of a good wife in the 17th century. In the 18th century, by the 19th century, you'd see spinning wheels above poorhouses because this is what poor women did in poorhouses. Um, they had to work for wages to sort of keep uh, their families together. While most men were farmers in this period, there were plenty of artisans, and this was not the middle class. This was a sort of working class. Many of these are working class professions. Um, they worked in or near the homes, and often alongside or near their wives, and they had uh, their clothing signified that sort of bib in the front would signify who you are. This is a cooper on the right, someone who made barrels, a carpenter on the left. And by looking at their hands, by looking at their hats, by looking at their clothing, the kerchief that they wore around the neck would identify a man as being a member of the working class. For men, then the white collar, as I said, suggested respectability. And this is Alexander Graham Bell, and it's the white collar that sort of shows that he is a member of the middle class, a man of means and education. Again, this would be the top 10% of Americans. As men of means and education took jobs in banking as engineers and clerks and managers, these new professions that emerge, they left their wives at home with the exclusive responsibility of caring for children. And so you start to see some differences in the way that women dress and act by the Victorian period. Women tend to grow their nails longer and paint them, and the long nails are evidence that you don't work, that you don't have a garden in front to sort of keep yourself going. You see very distinctive clothing, and you see women spending much more time with children. Family sizes for the middle class also decrease, and particularly for these folks, right? Not for eye gouging. You don't have the long nails for eye gouging, but you use the long nails basically to show off that you're not growing cabbages in your front yard. No, there's not a whole lot of contempt for new money. Money is money particularly in Europe. Now, it's in New York City. There is a group that's called the Knickerbocker elite, which are the old Dutch, and they don't much care for the English elite. So there is some sense of old versus new wealth to a certain extent, particularly in New York. The Vanderbilts and the Astors, for example, looking down on the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, who just made their fortune in the 1860s and 1870s. So you did see some distinction in this regard, but the places where those folks met were like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Natural History. They would become donors and supporters. Operas and things like that became the way that a new elite would sort of blend in with older elites. Families become smaller. So in 1800, the average woman had 7 children. By 1850, that average is 6 children. And by 1900, that average is 3.5 children. Okay, so why is this? Why are middle class families more likely to have smaller families? Now, this demographic change is happening across the board, but it's more pronounced with middle class families. So why would middle class? So 7 is about 4 too many. Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's how they're doing it. They're marrying later. There's some birth control. In the 1850s, we see condoms emerging, growing out of rubber works and things like that. Education. So a little bit more about education. Why is education matter, and what's important here? Birth rates strongly correlate with wealth. Okay, but why would a middle class family want to have a smaller number of children? we it's possible to them for them to do it, and because they're marrying later, as Claire said, that's important. They are marrying later. Okay, schooling is very important. So if you're not on a family farm, the kids are not free labor. So if you're on a farm, the more kids you have, the more labor you have relatively quickly. You have somewhat smaller spaces. Good. Not having need for more income in the household and not having much agriculture to farm. So basically, in this environment where, say, 1800, where a wealthy family is expected to be sort of moving west. There are lots of children. Those children are laborers at some point, and then expanded. But the cost of education ends up being more of a cost and less of a benefit than previously. Families partly used to have a lot of children to be able to put them to work, and now that wasn't necessary. Excellent. So this is what's happening. We should. One thing I should say: you all are in college, and the number of people who are in college in your age bracket is something like 30%. In 1880, it was 1%, and in 1890, it was 2%. So the percentage of people that are in college is really, really tiny. I'm not sure what that Gabe's question is. So the number of you are in college, you are in university. I think I'm pretty sure you guys are in university. I hope so. Not everybody here is in university. Some of you are just here to watch. I am assuming that this is the class, but other people are welcome to join us. So maybe Babe 45 is not in college. That's apologies for making that assumption. Okay, so couples were making deliberate decisions then to limit family size. The other thing that's happening is that fewer children means larger inheritances, and so the inheritances aren't divided up among so few people. 19th century marriage manuals rightly stress the harmful effects of too many births, and middle class couples tended to marry only when the man could support a family. And so marriages, as Claire said, I think, were later. Women seem to be behind the declining birth rate. Another thing that's happening in part in this intentional attention to limiting family sizes is an upswing in abortions. Once surgical abortions become common after 1830, they become more common. And one sign of the upswing in abortions is the increase of legislation about it. So in 1821 to 1841, 10 states and one territory start to prohibit abortions because it becomes relatively easy. By 1860, 20 states had outlawed it, although it was rarely enforced. Yeah, they always do look very happy in these things. So for this new middle class, the emphasis was on women's confinement and responsibility for the home, what people call the cult of domesticity, which encouraged women's control of their own bodies. And if nothing else, men were gone a lot more of the time because men are in middle class families are further away. As one woman put it, a woman's duty was not to subdue male passions, but not to kindle male passions, but to subdue them. Yeah, angel of the household, a doll's house. So a late Victorian mother allegedly told her daughter about the inevitability of intercourse on her wedding night. She said, "Close your eyes and think of England." Right? That intercourse was part of the reason that we have this idea that Victorian women are kind of frigid or whatever is in part connected to this decline, very intensive attempt to decline or limit fertility, and it's not always that easy to do that. There obviously, as you know, you can there are no birth control pills at this period, but you can change sex so that it's off the your cycle. But a lot of the marriage manuals and advice manuals had the cycle exactly backwards in the 1840s. So when people were actually most fertile, they were told that they were the least fertile. Yeah, so this contrast is, so a lot of what we call middle class morality grows out of this real, important attempt to kind of minimize or shrink family sizes, which has something to do with this ideal of the pure and passionless white woman, which would measured against the immigrant and working class women. And so the stereotype of the working class immigrant woman was identical, in fact, in some ways to the supposedly primitive sexual slave in the antebellum period. Apologists for slavery regularly argue that Africans were more primitive than whites and therefore less civilized sexually. They rationalize white men's sexual encounters with slaves by arguing that masters didn't rape slaves, that slave women enticed them. And there's a similar kind of view that these immigrant women are kind of depraved and sexually loose. But again, this is connected to ideas in part about restriction of fertility. That said, the children become much more important in middle class households by the 1860s and 1870s, in part because there are fewer of them. And so there we see really the beginning of what we'd call childhood. And childhood in the sense that a child is not just a little person, but is supposed to be cared for and is supposed to have toys and is supposed to, have a kind of inner life that has to be developed before school. And so we see before, entering the work world. And so we see things like toys emerge in the 1860s and 1870s, distinctive things that are supposed to be sort of educated. These toys. These are actually lead figurines. Absolutely the worst thing you should give to children, but it seemed like a really good idea in the 1860s and 1870s because those lead figurines, you just stick them in your mouth and they're sweet because they're lead, and of course those kids. Yeah, so this is when you get brats, basically. The idea of the sort of entitled child, I suppose. So while colonial American men were socialized to be strong patriarchal fathers, 19th century middle class men were shunted off to a separate sphere to be competitive businessmen. And these competitive businessmen were in their own world, a sort of a man's world. So if true womanhood meant piety, virtue, and domesticity, true manhood meant good character and the will to resist temptations, kind of self-mastery, if you will. And again, this is connected in part to the sort of decline in fertility, a strength to protect those weaker than themselves, their wives, children, and yes, that's McKinley's cabinet. Excellent. So this is just to sort of give you a sense of the sort of boardroom, but this is McKinley and his cabinet. So manhood then was about protecting people weaker than themselves, their wives, children, and their employees. Their credit rating company, Dun and Bradstreet. Right. So yeah, these are people you want to basically punch. The Gilded Age, man, the sort of gentleman of the middle and upper middle class, was the kind of person that you'd likely want to punch. The credit rating company Dun and Bradstreet assessed a man's worthiness for credit based on his honesty, his probity, and his family life. And so family life was an important thing. If you wanted to get credit, you had to be like this image of the sort of Victorian retiring man. Someone who had great wealth was reliable about paying, and this is where we get the term A number one. A number one was someone who had a lot of wealth, that was the A, and number one meant they paid their debts. Someone with great wealth who didn't pay his debts would be A number four. And someone with little wealth but who paid his debts might be C number one. And so Dun & Bradstreet made these confidential reports, but they would go around looking at people and inspecting their families, so basically spying on them, and these became the credit reports. So when you get a credit report, you can get a number, but then credit reports were done by people who were basically spies who would look in on your family. If you were at the bottom of this list, you were called good for nothing, and that expression "good for nothing" is one that initially starts with the Dun & Bradstreet reports. So the appearance of yes, exactly, Ford and Rockefeller both. My dad told this story that Rockefeller would invite someone to go out to breakfast with him, and at a restaurant, and watch to see if the man salted his eggs before he ate them. And if he salted his eggs before he ate them, then he wouldn't be hired by Rockefeller, because the point was you were supposed to test the eggs to see if they were salted or not, before you put the salt on. So there was this really very much, and this is how you get this sort of reinforcement of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition, is that many of these people who come to positions of authority and wealth come from a certain background, and they look for that in others. So dress for men was very distinctive. A man dressed about who is in the middle or upper middle class would dress 3 times during the day. Morning dress, and then a promenade or visiting dress, and then an evening or ball dress. So if you planned to attend a bachelor party and you were a man, you could dress somewhat informally because there would be no women present. You could wear, for example, a coat of some dark color, generally termed medley colored, cut rounded over the hips, a black cap, an inner vest, buttoning rather high in the breast, dark gray trousers, a black silk neckerchief, or a ribbed silk scarf. Anything else, and the presumption was that you didn't really understand your position. The extremities were the most important. A well-appointed hat, faultlessly fitting gloves, and immaculate boots were the essentials to a well-dressed man. And so manners were the restraint of all things noisy, rude, and boisterous. Creating a scene was terribly bad form. And its worst manners books said that middle-class men sometimes so carefully maintained nonchalance that they resembled resuscitated ghosts who moved around almost untouched by the world around them. And this is, again, self-possession and self-restraint that suggested manliness. This meant food should be broiled meats, not fried, no warm bread, no condiments, sauces, and stimulants, which were all bad. Even salad dressing was considered dangerous because it excited the passions. And so moderation in all things. Right. And so, as you can imagine, their digestive systems would also, in this 10-course luncheon, be quite a mess. And of course, also, this is partly how you get the sort of image of the fat capitalist is that moving around, traveling around, engaging in sports and things like that, at least in the early part of the Gilded Age, was considered not really gentlemanly. You'd go out for to shoot something, but with your dog, but you wouldn't engage in kind of rough or masculine sports. And so this sort of manhood then was about distinguishing yourself from the working class. It is true. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of pornography in this period. I'm not going to go there, but it is interesting that pornography expands in the Gilded Age. But you could argue that this is also about self-restraint. That this is about using pornography instead of prostitutes, right? An attempt to kind of maintain that sort of enclosed exactly space. Okay, so that's middle class manhood. Working class manhood is very different. Working class men drank enormous amounts of liquor at work and after it. And they socialized at bars and music halls. Middle class men were supposed to join temperance organizations and so this is a bar. And the term saloon, and we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt is the person who brings around this new kind of image of masculinity, really in what we call the progressive era. So there's a kind of Gilded Age masculinity, and then there's going to be a manhood that's going to emerge around 1900, associated with Teddy Roosevelt and others, and a very different kind of emphasis on physical activity. But in this period, from 1870 to 1900, it's this sort of refined, indwelling, passionless man that's the ideal. Working class men engaged in rough sports like wrestling and boxing. Middle class men were supposed to disdain such shows of coarse behavior. The central place for working class men was a new institution called the saloon, which was different from a bar. A saloon was a place that had swinging doors. You've seen the swinging doors in the Old West saloons, right? And they're like halfway doors, the doors that you can see underneath and see above. And the reason for that, saloon is basically they take the French word salon, And a saloon was supposed to be a reform of the bar. It was supposed to be open so that police could look in at any time and make sure that there was no prostitution going on in the back of a bar, which was very likely, to make sure that children weren't drinking, or young children weren't drinking at the bar. There was a kind of informal rule in the Gilded Age that as soon as you could hook your chin over the counter, you could buy a pitcher of beer and walk home with it, presumably for parents and things like that. So there wasn't really a drinking age, so to speak, but the idea of children getting drunk in bars was something, as you can imagine, that many reformers wanted to control. And so the saloon was an attempt to sort of prevent that from happening. Uh, Unlike other shopkeepers, saloon keepers tended to be little distinguished from the ethnic and working class clientele. There were Irish bars, there were Italian bars, there were German bars, there were Dutch bars, there were Hungarian bars, hunky bars, and each one was basically tended to be very ethnically homogenous. Um, or they tended to be homogenous in terms of work. So you had a pipe fitter's bar, or you had a carpenter's bar, or you had a construction worker's bar in cities and even in relatively small towns. These saloon keepers had the saloons and bars met many of the social needs of working class men. They weren't just bars; they were public toilets. There were places where you could get food because food was free in a bar as long as you drank. There were places for warmth, particularly in the winter. There were places for clean water, which was not easy to get. Um, right, if you could man a machine, you could buy a draft. So public toilets, food, warmth, clean water. There were also meeting spaces, and so lodges and unions and things like that tended to meet in bars. The bar was also a check cashing service. So you'd take in your check to the bar and they would cash it for you if you were paid by check. They tended to be newspapers here that would be on a table when you walked in, and they were free for working class men who were excluded from other areas. And so this was a kind of a male space, very much, but one that was a very working class space and just sort of defined male masculinity. So this is an Italian saloon, an image of an Italian saloon. And this was a place where there would be centers for celebrations like weddings and holidays, meeting places for fraternal orders and gangs, and was certainly a place for a small-time politician to rustle up votes. It was a place of companionship. Yeah, the free food part is not really visible in bars anymore. Um, it was as much a desire for the company of other men as binge drinking. It was a world of jokes or off-colored stories, usually at the expense of middle-class men. And jokes tended to be about hypocritical advocates of temperance or dishonest police or easily fooled clergy or stupid or pompous judges. This is where one sang ribald songs, usually about women, or either Dear Old Mom or The Girl Who Was Tempted and Either Fell or Didn't Fall. Irish songs were often old, but those of the most popular had a political ring to them that often pointed to the power of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant and the dangers of English rule. Pubs like this would be decorated with pictures of fighters, sprinters, and clog dancers. And especially among the Irish, there was a very strong bachelor subculture, given that men didn't marry on average until the age of 31. Drinking and treating. Yeah, the temperance movements, the saloon, in fact, was a result of the temperance movement. The bars were older, going all the way back, to the Middle Ages, but the saloon was the first attempt to sort of respond to the temperance movement by opening up bars and making them more accessible and visible. This is the temperance movement in the mid-19th century, 1860s and 70s. Drinking and treating were a kind of conspicuous consumption, often rejecting the world of accumulation associated with bank accounts and mortgages. Okay, so this is what working class masculinity was about, and it was often very distinct from middle class masculinity. And it's important to understand because many of the reforms of the progressive era, that some of which started in the 1890s, are going to be by these middle class folks. and they're going to be in part attempts to make working class people like them. So it, this is both kind of good and bad, I suppose. I don't want to have kind of pass any moral judgment on it, but this is from the perspective of middle class people who believe that working class families are broken, that they don't speak English well enough, and that they need to be assimilated. The term that Wilson uses is not Wilson, Roosevelt uses is to eliminate hyphenated Americans, so not not Irish Americans, but just simply Americans. So some of these progressive reforms are really, many of these progressive reforms that we're going to talk about later come from the middle class. They're designed to make the middle class more like the working class. And so it's tend to be fairly invasive culturally. It's tended to break up these sorts of things. But as I say, yeah, there were things that were valuable about these progressive reforms. If we think about the death rate in cities, death rates were high. They were 30 to 40% higher. It was actually 50% higher in urban areas than they were in rural areas in 1850 in the United States. So you're 50% more likely to die at a younger age in New York or Philadelphia or Boston in 1850. But with pure food and drug, partly because of temperance reform, partly because of the attempts to minimize fires, partly because of civil service reform, which makes civil servants more trained than they had been previously, partly with halfway houses and settlement houses and things like that, we do see death rates decline in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s for working class people. And so some of these middle class reformers, while they were culturally pretty obnoxious in terms of wanting to make people like themselves, at the same time, in some ways, they provided benefits that actually did help improve people's lives. Perhaps the most important of these is going to be education. By the 1870s and 1880s, many middle class reformers believed strongly in education, believed that people should get schooling. Fewer than 30% of working class folks had more than a year or two of schooling, and often for immigrants, that schooling would be in another language. Attempts to kind of keep children in school and not in workhouses and things like that was opposed by many working class families because they wanted to have their kids working beside them. But in a longer term sense, the education that was provided them was likely to extend their lives. So every political movement in the Gilded Age will rely some sense on these stereotypes about men and women. Prohibition was the attempt to remove the taint of immigrant rowdiness. Women's suffrage was to bring a way of bringing virtuous white women into the vote to prevent their being overwhelmed by the ignorant working class men. The sense of the small family was the norm in many of these reforms, and working class immigrants as the deviation. Of course, as I've suggested, the working class, if you will, in the United States is something like 90% of the population. The deviants, to a certain extent, are the middle class. But this fear of working class immigrants who have relatively large families helps feed the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement is basically attempts to enforce sterilization for immigrant families, to enforce sterilization of the infirm and others, because of a fear that native whites won't reproduce as much as the sensual Irish and Italians. So the reforms that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks are reforms that are sort of generated from this world in which masculinity and femininity are viewed as kind of a norm, and the working class people who are, I would guess, most of our ancestors were viewed as the exception. Were viewed as the ones who were kind of messed up. But in the longest term, we could say that the reforms of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era are mixed, not entirely as horrible as we might expect. Okay, thanks so much. And I'm going to talk about Wikipedia on Wednesday. I've already returned the papers. They're returned in the they're returned on ELC. I sent them back as PDFs, and any comments or questions and things like that. But thanks so much, And see you guys on Wednesday.